Welcome to History 102, where YouTube creator What If Alt-Hists Rudyard Lynch and I dive into critical moments in history and tease out patterns to help us predict the future. Let's jump right in.
Hey, bud. Good to see you. Excited
Good to see you too. Your
excited
beard
to do
has
this.
grown out more fully.
Yeah, we'll see how long I can keep it at this rate.
You are
But
attaining the
yeah,
Mediterranean physiognomy through which you were born.
yes, exactly. Goals. The YouTube comments were more sanguine on ancient India than I would have expected. People seem
Yeah,
to
I was
like
surprised
it and
too.
not. Yeah.
I assumed that video would get a shit ton of garbage. Like I just assumed that video would just be completely lambasted. Because when I've made India videos in the main channel, it's like the worst. I get more hate for India videos than I do for talking about the Nazis, which
Okay.
makes sense considering there's 1.5 billion Indians in the world and there's only half that number of Europeans.
Right.
The world
Very few
of the videos we've done so far, the ones that got the most criticism are the world wars in the U.S. Civil War. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, we got a good one today. Shall we get into ancient China? We've done modern
we have
China,
ancient
but
China.
now we'll get into ancient China.
Yeah, so we'll do a couple different Chinas. This video is going to cover China from its foundation around 2000 BC until the fall of the Han Dynasty, which is around 200 AD. So covering the entire ancient period. And I do not have a Chinese weapon because I am a racist. Well, I don't collect Asian weapons. Just kidding for those who don't understand irony. I know the internet is a weird place. Yes, I've spent a vast amount of time studying said civilization, but I hate them somehow. So Chinese history. And China is interesting because it's off in a different dimension where one of the questions you asked in the Vikings video I thought was very good is, was the world of the the ancient and medieval world multipolar? And the short answer is not really. It's like there are these different orbs that are strung together by thread. And those four orbs are Europe, the Middle East. Europe and the Middle East are fused. They're the two who fought each other the most because there's not a clear border between them. So Europe/Middle East, India, and China. And so until the very, very end of the period we're talking about, China has no concept that the rest of the world exists. They don't know there are any other civilizations in the world. And so China is evolving in its own different direction. And it's interesting to see Chinese history over the ancient period parallels the histories of Europe and the Middle East and India. So you can see that human history follows certain patterns, even if you're completely disconnected. And the other thing is that China is the oldest still surviving nation in the world, where, for example, Egypt is the first country to form, but the Egypt of today bears very little relation to the Egypt of the pharaohs. Or the Greeks formed as an ethnic identity really quickly, but Greece has been conquered so many times and they've been changed their religion and been reformed. And the China that comes out of this time period is basically the same China as China today. And if you look at modern China, they have all these same institutions as what they had around before the birth of Christ. Same religion, same government system, same ethnicity, same language, same writing code. They're the same people. And it's equivalent to imagine if Rome was still today and Europeans still worshipped the Roman gods and they even dressed like Romans, or the capital of Europe was still in Rome, just stuff like that. And before we get started, it's interesting that I put this video after India because people like to, if you're in anthropology, there's a couple different cultural axes. So you have individualist to communitarian, where the most individualistic peoples are the Americans and the British, and the most communitarian are the Japanese and the Koreans. Then you have high trust to low trust. And so like Norway and Japan are the most high trust societies, and Africa is the least high trust or the lowest trust. And so you have all these axes in anthropology, but one of the most important axes, India and China are at the exact opposite, in that in China, the state took over everything, and the religion is very weak in China. Well, in India, on the other side, the religion is very strong in India, but the state didn't develop. And in Chinese history has tried to do everything they can to weaken the power of class. Of the four big Eurasian civilizations, China is the one where class is the least important. And in India, as we saw in the last episode, they turned class into their entire society. And China survived as this one, it splits up a lot and gets conquered, but there's this one giant state that existed for over 2,000 years. And in India, there's hundreds of ethnic groups, hundreds of religions, all unified around this shared religion. And so you look at, these are both Asian societies, but they are vastly different as Asian societies.
Let's get into more of the differences.
The differences will make sense as I tell the story, so we'll gradually get to them.
Great.
But they formed at roughly similar times, in which in the Bronze Age world, you had an empire based out of northern China. You had a node of civilization in modern Pakistan. You had one in the Middle East and Egypt. And so civilization first formed around river valleys, because humans generally don't like being civilized. Humans want to be out in their tribes, out in the woods, hunting and fishing and that stuff. And it's actively difficult to get humans to cooperate and form societies together where they have to work under a government. And it happens around places where you need to control water supplies. And so if you look at Egypt, Mesopotamia, Pakistan with the Harappan civilization, northern China, what all of these places have in common is you need to manage water supplies. And in northern China, this region, it's like the latitude of the American mid-Atlantic. So Chinese civilization started in the north of the country, and it gradually colonized their entire temperate zone. And China inhabits the same latitude as North America. So Beijing is at the latitude of Philadelphia. Shanghai is at the latitude of New Orleans. Miami is at the latitude of Hong Kong. And Quebec is Harbin. And so the area where Chinese civilization started is the latitude of like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, that area. And that area is on the edge of the grasslands, and it's very dry, and it's dead flat, and the Yellow River flows through it. And the Yellow River is this very strong. There are three big rivers that China is known for: the Yellow in the north, the Yangtze in the middle, and the Pearl in the south. And the Yellow River, it changes its course by 300 miles, and it floods rapidly. And when the Yellow River floods, it kills millions of people. And so the Chinese developed their society around controlling the flowing of the Yellow River and having irrigation trenches, where irrigation is a system where you spread water around a field. You dig ditches around a field to spread water around. And so all the earliest civilizations are based off irrigation, because you have to bring people together in order to have them work and to coordinate labor. And China, like all those other societies, was a theocracy. And because the thing is, you gather all these people together, they have to work together on a farm, they have to get the irrigation canals rolling. And so the way you assuage, is that the way you pronounce it? The way you assuage the anxieties of these farming peoples is to tell them that our society exists to serve the gods. So we sacrifice stuff to the gods. Then the gods give us rain. And so all those societies turned into India, Babylon, Egypt, China were all originally theocracies as the priest class ran stuff. And the Chinese alphabet actually started with, they had turtle shells, and they would burn the turtle shells to talk to the gods. And they would write scribbles in the turtle shell to talk to the gods. And then that became the Chinese alphabet over thousands of years. And the purpose, and this is the Shang dynasty. The Shang were a dynasty around 1500 BC. Civilization started in China a couple thousand years after the Middle East or India. And around 1500 BC, the Shang dynasty, they based their right to rule off communing through the gods with these turtle shells. And China was a pretty small geographic area around the North Chinese plain. And there are earlier records there were mounds, and the Stone Age peoples of China would build these giant mounds. And Chinese nationalists are really unhinged. The Chinese nationalists might actually be worse than Indian nationalists, but they don't go on YouTube because YouTube is banned in China. So if you're a Chinese nationalist, you don't go on YouTube because it's against the Chinese government. And so I've happily stayed away from Chinese nationalists. But when I do talk to them, they just say the most unhinged stuff ever. Like, the more you read Chinese history, the more you realize China constantly gets conquered by the barbarians. And Chinese nationalists will say, no, they were really Chinese. And I'm like, we know they weren't. Or they'll say, they say, because in Chinese history, they say China was built by the yellow dragon. The first emperor was a great dragon, and the dragon taught the Chinese civilization, and they taught them how to farm and be a society. And like, as ancient tribal myths go, that's a pretty cool one. But at the same time, you can't build a modern history off it. But in the Chinese historical tradition, they said that the dragon emperor built China in 3000 BC. So Chinese nationalists are very attached to saying Chinese civilization started in 3000 BC, and basically saying Chinese civilization is older than it is. And do you have any questions before we move on to the next time period?
No, let's move on.
Okay. So you had the Shang dynasty, and the Shang dynasty kept going until 1000 BC. So like, I need to look up the exact dates. I think like 1400 BC, 1500 BC to 1000 BC. And 1000 BC is a period called the Bronze Age collapse, where the Bronze Age world, it just fell apart, and only a handful of societies survived. And so in the Middle East, the Hittites fell, the Greeks fell, the Mycenaean Greeks fell. There were the Sea peoples who nearly took down a lot of cities in that area, nearly took down Egypt. Civilization was totally fried in India. And what happened is that the Zhou barbarians took over China. And so Zhou is spelled Zhou, but it's pronounced Joe, like Joseph, which is one of the weird things about how Chinese works. And we think the Zhou might have been Turks or Siberians, or the part of Western China. White people are the indigenous inhabitants of Central Asia. And so the first inhabitants of Western China were white people. So there is a theory that like this variety of white people might have conquered China under the Zhou, but I think the Zhou were probably Mongols or Turks or Siberians. What I've read the most evidence for is Turks. And the Shang monarchy had grown decadent and degenerate. And it's funny for me as a historian, I study a lot of history, and people like to say decadence doesn't exist, but the more ancient history you read, the more you realize that there's no way decadence doesn't exist, because you see it so many times in the ancient world. And so the Shang monarchy were decadent, and then the Zhou barbarians took over. And this is 1000 BC. This is the same time as Moses, as like the Iliad and the Odyssey, that sort of thing. And they invoked a concept which has stayed for all of Chinese history since, called the Mandate of Heaven. And the Mandate of Heaven is this idea that the heaven, or God, bestows the right to rule upon a certain emperor. And that the emperor, as long as he's good, he maintains the approval of the heavens. But if he's bad, the heavens then revoke his right to rule. And And so there are droughts, there's flooding, there's rebellions, there's famines, and what all of these are is a sign from God or heaven. Hey, we don't want you anymore. And this is an idea that's been very powerful for all of Chinese history. And even in Tiananmen Square, the Chinese who were rebelling against the Communist Party, they said, you don't have the mandate of heaven anymore. Or China experienced really horrifying both flooding and droughts over the last couple years. And so I've said that this will be interpreted as a sign of the mandate of heaven. And this all happened 3,000 years ago, but it's still valid in the Chinese worldview. But then the irony is that, and this is, you will always be killed by what you sow into the world, is that the Zhou dynasty 500 years later, which is a really good run, they were wiped out by the same mandate of heaven. And the idea of the mandate of heaven, we think it was actually a pretty big influence on Rousseau's social contract, or the idea that there's a contract between ruler and ruled, which became really big in Western Enlightenment philosophy. But the Zhou dynasty took over, and they split China up into feudal estates, where they gave their nobility different parts of China. And again, this is a 500-year period, and it's easy to say this in one sentence and forget that. But over centuries, much like feudalism everywhere else in the world, it naturally weakens the central government. And so these nobility became stronger and stronger until what eventually happened is that China stopped being a unified country. And so what occurred once China was no longer unified is it was split into a bunch of different countries. And you could look at a map of these. There used to be dozens of them in, let's say, 500 BC. And China at this point entered a period of profound cultural innovation in which societies oftentimes go through their biggest cultural evolutions when it doesn't look like they're doing a lot politically. So almost all of modern Western culture stems from the European Middle Ages, but the European Middle Ages aren't as exciting as the period after. Greek culture stems from the Greek Dark Age. We talked about India, the same thing. And so Chinese civilization developed in first the Spring and Autumn period, which then bled into the Warring States period. And the Spring and Autumn period is a time period of aristocratic noble warfare. And so you hear these stories of these nobles fighting each other, and they take turns to see who attacks someone else, or they capture another noble leader, and then they let them go out of their honor. And so this is a very aristocratic, honor-driven, civilized society. And this is like 700. This is like 500 BC until 300 BC. And China went through a period of nihilism. And keep in mind, I said before that you can find equivalents in China's development to India or Europe, where China hit the axial age at the exact same time as Europe and India did. And I said before in the previous video, the axial age was a time period around 500 BC, where Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha, and Socrates, alongside possibly Zoroaster, all lived at the same time. And there were all these religious figures. And for those who didn't watch the India video yesterday, the reasoning for the axial age is that coins broke apart previous social connections. So beforehand, every social relation was done through an IOU, where let's say a guy plows your field. He plows your field, and in exchange, you give him a percent of the harvest. Everything's done through an interpersonal relationship. With the invention of coins, it broke apart that in the same manner the internet has for modern socializing. And that resulted in social breakdown. And in China, it was through economic exploitation, slavery, genocide, military brutality, and sexual degeneracy, and nihilism. And so over this period, we have lots of writings people at the time were like saying everyone's a horrible person. Nothing makes sense. It's all chaos. And so this time period was one of social breakdown and nihilism and banditry and sexual deviancy and everything else you can imagine around 500 BC. And out of this, the first two philosophers we talked about, Confucius and Lao Tzu, who lived at the same time, and the two of them formed ideological views in China that operated as counterweights to the other, in which, let's start with Confucianism. Confucianism is this idea of reciprocal social contracts controlling life. And so, for example, an employer has duties to take care of his employees, but they also have duties to be loyal to him. A father has duties to his children. And in Confucianism, everything is based upon loyalty to your father, paternal, filial piety. And so in that sort of worldview, and I just want to say Confucius was basically accurate, where I've done a lot of anthropological assessment, and you can actually use how societies view their fathers. In every society, the role of the father in that society is comparable to the role of the government. And so you can look at a society's family structure and use that to predict its political ideology. And Confucius realized that 2,500 years ago. And so he said, we must stabilize the family in order to have a stable society because everything starts in the family. And that's basically true. And it's only something that we're just discovering now in the West. But one of my ideas is that if a society tries an idea for thousands of years, that means it's probably true. and so Confucianism created China in that mold. And Confucius was a low-level bureaucrat in his own time. He wasn't particularly successful. Many historians think he was autistic. And the reason they think he's autistic is we have records of him, for example, only eating meat if it's cut into certain cubes. Or Confucius, his whole idea is that we have to return to the moral system of the early Zhou, because Confucius lived in the spring and autumn period where the Zhou monarchy, they'd become like the Pope, but then there were all these warring states. And so Confucius looked back to the golden age of the early Zhou 500 years later and said, if we can act in the moral manner of the early Zhou, then society will be fine. Because he saw people were more moral under the early Zhou. Thus, if we could follow their values, we will be a more moral society. And Confucius is probably the most conservative philosopher ever in world history. It's just, I can't think of anyone more conservative than him. And so there's some interesting stories we have from Confucius. One is he wrote a poem about how there is this ancient royal cup who was used for ceremonies called the Gugu cup. And he said, we've lost the Gugu cup, so I can't use it for ceremonies properly. I so wish that I could have that Gugu cup. He also said there's a certain ritual to enter a front door and to enter a hallway. And hallway had a different meaning back then. It's like a feasting hall. And he said you should follow the ceremonial entrance on how to enter a feasting hall in the manner that it was done 500 years before, rather than the colloquial way it was done at the time, because if it's older, it's better. And so Confucianism, I'm sorry if I'm speaking glibly about a religion which has provided comfort and sustenance for millions of people over thousands of years. I don't mean any disrespect. And Confucianism has a couple advantages, and I think it can't be overstated that Confucianism kept China alive, because I think one of the reasons China survived and Rome fell is that China had Confucianism, where Confucianism, you're not allowed to exploit your followers. And I think a big reason the Roman Empire fell and China didn't is the Chinese established Confucianism, because if you look at the fall of the Roman Empire, the breakdown of authority resulted in superiors oppressing inferiors, and then that resulted in a breakdown of the social structure. And At the same time, the solidification of the Chinese family resulted in the Chinese state doing very well. And China is, as I said before, the only state to have survived that long in that size. And Confucianism also establishes a very high premium on education, which is why if you look at the highest achievers educationally and people study the most, it's the Confucian East Asian countries like Korea, Japan, China, and they're the ones who do the best in education because Confucius set a very high premium in education. And Confucian societies also, they put a very high respect into ceremony, where they say that all of human life has to have ceremonies so that you can control social interactions. So in a Confucian society, greeting your boss politely is a moral issue. It's not just politeness. It's a moral thing in of itself. And you saw this across Chinese history where the Chinese obsession with ceremonies can get ridiculous. I was visiting the Imperial Palace in Beijing, and they were talking about how the emperor, a vast part of his job was managing all the imperial ceremonies, not actually governing the empire. And when you see China go off the rails, as we'll see later with Wang Mang, Chinese rulers under Confucian societies just obsess over ritual and ceremony rather than actually doing stuff. And so we covered Confucianism, and the China of 500 BC, you saw the crystallization of three belief structures. The first is Confucianism. And then the third one is, it'll make sense. The second one is Daoism. And Lao Tzu is supposedly the founder of Daoism. And Daoism and Confucianism operated as counterweights in Chinese civilization, through which they balance each other out. Because the point of Confucianism is you should follow these strict social duties so that society stays together. And the point of Daoism, and Daoism is a crystallization of Chinese folk beliefs. And there's a couple different elements of Daoism. There's an alchemy aspect and magic aspect. There's a meditative aspect. There's some ceremonies. It's hard to pin down Daoism. And Lao Tzu was supposedly this secret holy man who wandered around China doing rituals. And every part of Daoism is about follow the way. The universe has this way. You should follow the current. And Daoism is taught through paradoxical lessons. And so I read the Tao Te Ching when I was a teenager, and I thought it was complete bullshit. But now that I reread it, I understand the deep wisdom that's conveyed through it, through paradox, that I was not wise enough to understand in high school. So Taoism comes across as idiotic when you first see it if you're uneducated, but then you realize it's actually conveying a deep point. And so, for example, like Taoism would say stuff like, if you search for money, you will not get money. But if you do not care for money, you will get it. And one example of that is, let's say you're a YouTuber and I know loads of YouTubers are just in it for the money. They grow tired, they burn out. But if you're a YouTuber and you genuinely care about your topic and it's not about the money, that allows you to actually keep going. And so Taoism is very vibey, very chill, and Confucianism is more rigid. And so in China, there's no idea of religious intolerance. And so the same person can be Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist at the same time. And so Confucianism and Taoism provided a psychological balance inside China. And then all of these are descended from folk beliefs, where China in a lot of ways is the same religion as what it did in prehistory, where the Chinese folk beliefs, they have survived because both Confucianism and Taoism are derivations of Chinese folk beliefs, and the most powerful force in Chinese religion is ancestor worship. And most places in the world have gotten rid of ancestor worship, except China. And in Chinese religion, one of the most important things is to honor the grave of your ancestors and honor your parents, as well as ideas of natural spirits or demons. And so because there are other regional competitors, China kept more of its original prehistoric culture than you normally see across Eurasia. um, because of that. And so out of this warring states period, in 500 BC in the Axial Age came Confucianism and Daoism. But then after that, the warring states got a lot bloodier. And another tangent before we get too far, Sun Tzu lived in the warring states period. The famous general who wrote The Art of War. And Sun Tzu was a general for the kingdom of Wu in modern Shanghai. And he fought very well. He wasn't actually an important historic figure. He's just interesting. And so warring states period gets worse. We're in the spring and autumn period. It's this aristocratic warrior class who are fighting in a very civilized war. And then as the warring states period goes along, the armies get bigger, the battles get bloodier. It's like World War I, where you have giant trench warfare, armies of millions of people. And so what you saw with that was the destruction of the old aristocracy, because in the spring and autumn period, you just couldn't. The armies got so big, and periods of total war promote equality because everyone's equal in the trench together. And so China went through this period of arming, and the warring states period was the bloodiest war in all of ancient history. It's hard to believe because you read records of it, and like 500,000 men would fight at certain battles. And most ancient armies are like 70,000 guys. But when China wants to go to war, they really go to war. And the warring states period, it got absolutely bloody and absolutely brutal. It was all, as these states were just consuming each other in international warfare. And they also became coarsified and standardized. So the old nobility, the old religion, that grew weaker as the state grew stronger. And the faction that eventually won the warring states period was Qin. And the word China is from Qin. And Qin was this kingdom on the northwestern frontier of China against the barbarians, where they were up against the Indo-Aryan and the Turkic barbarians in northwest China. And in these sorts of things, it's normally the frontier nation which eventually wins. In the West, America, the frontier nation won. In Rome was up against the Celts. In India, it was the Mauryaans who were up in the northwest frontier. In China, it was the Qin. And so the Qin were able to grow by expanding against barbarians, but they were then able to turn their strength in at the rest of China. And so the Qin built this, they removed the titles of nobility, and they created this very aggressive militaristic society where all men they had conscription, and they developed this someone else developed this philosophy, but they adopted a social code called legalism. And legalism, the idea behind it is that the people in a country are chess pieces in the emperor's strategy game. And so what that means is that the people don't have an identity. They don't have souls. It's the duty of the king to treat his people like cogs. And I read some legalist texts when I was in college. They literally said a king should not love his wives so much because then they'll make him weak and they'll make him irrational. And so you can see with this that Qin was this very brutal authoritarian country. And the Qin were able to unify China under the leader Cixi Huangdi, who was probably the most famous emperor in Chinese history. And because he conquered all the warring states, and then he turns China into the most totalitarian state of the ancient world. So in China under Cixi Huangdi, they built the first version of the Great Wall of China against the northern barbarians. They actually conquered South China, which is something I'm surprised no one else talks about, because the southern half of China, that was all local tribes. But the Qin dynasty, they conquered the southern half of China really quickly within a decade, that doubled the size of China through using a strategy involving river warfare. And the South Chinese, they didn't really put up that much of a fight either, which is depressing. And so building the first version of the Great Wall, conquering northern China, unifying China, and he developed this horrifying legal code where if you did the slightest thing wrong, you'd get killed. And also your entire family would get killed. And so he split the population to these different communes where everyone was dependent upon everyone else. And so if one person committed a crime, everyone else in the commune would be punished. And there's a lot of parallels between legalism and communism for obvious reasons. And you can see that for most of Chinese history, Qixi Huangdi was hated in a lot of ways because he went against the priest class. He hated religion. And so he passed a bill where he burned all the old books because he thought intellectuals are lame and they hold back progress. And so the historian intellectual class hates him for that. And he wanted to get rid of Confucianism. He wanted to erase any evidence Confucianism existed. And the Confucians ran China. And so he's been hated over Chinese history. But the communists, for example, have loved Qixi Huangdi because he's a strong, progressive, unifying leader. But Qixi Huangdi, he was going crazy. And he was obsessed with living forever. And he thought that if he drank mercury, it would make him live forever. But in reality, it just killed him and made him go crazy. And he sent out a fleet to the Eastern Islands where he said, you guys need to discover the key to immortality. And if you don't discover the key to immortality, I'm going to kill all of you. A great example of his policies. So they just founded Japan because it's funny. You look at the foundation of civilization in Japan, it happened at exactly the same time as Qixi Huangdi sent his fleet out east. And these guys thought, hey, he's going to kill us. We're never going to find the key to immortality. Let's just populate Japan. And there already were Korean settlers in Japan, but they sparked off some of the first cities and stuff or advanced society in Japan. And he built the Terracotta Army. And I've been to the Terracotta Army. It's pretty based. It's tens of thousands of clay soldiers with individual features to protect him in his tomb. And some random farmer discovered it, it must be remarkable. And we actually haven't gotten to the inner vault where he kept his corpse because it's guarded off by mercury. So it's literally too dangerous. And he had these programs where he would just get labor from the populace and then work them to death through the military or building some giant palace for him or the Great Wall. He was one of the most totalitarian leaders. He is easily the most totalitarian leader of the ancient world. The problem with this is that you burn out goodwill pretty quickly. And so after Qixi Huangdi died of doing mercury too much, his empire completely fell apart. And a great story I love here is there was a group, the men who launched the revolution who wiped out his dynasty. They were a group of soldiers, and the penalty for arriving late to an army meetup point was death. And so there were a lot of storms in their area. They knew they were going to arrive late, and rather than turn themselves in to die, they decided we're going to launch a revolution. And so China spiraled into revolution and civil war due to that. And one of my favorite fiction books ever is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. And it's a Chinese fantasy novel set in a fantasy version of these events. And so in that book, you have fictionalized versions of Qixi Huangdi, this revolt. It's actually not a bad way to learn about the Chinese history of that time period, in the same way that for a couple seasons of Game of Thrones, I could predict what would happen in future seasons because it paralleled the history of the Wars of the Roses enough. And so if you watch Game of Thrones, you actually might learn a thing or two at the Wars of the Roses if you look at the parallels. But China fell into civil war, and one of the things about Chinese history, please humor me for this tangent, is they talk a lot about bandits. A civil war starts, and then bandits are at the highway. What they don't say is the bandits 10,000 guys. And so over Chinese history, you hear about bandits who are actually warlords and command armies. And that weirded me out over reading Chinese history because you keep on hearing about bandits. The reality is it's just some warlord. But with the way Chinese is translated and all that stuff, it gets written down as bandits. But back to the main point. Qixi Huangdi unified China. He was too brutal. He fell apart. And then there was a civil war. And two guys, there was this, I forget his name, but he was this aristocratic, very headstrong general. And he was working with this peasant leader. And let me look up the leader, the founder of the Han Dynasty's name. Keep in mind, I do these off the cuff. Liu Bang. Okay. Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, he was a peasant boy who rose up through the ranks to make himself leader of the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty are the equivalents of the Romans for China. They ruled from 200 BC to 280, and they were China's first great golden age. In the Qin Dynasty, although they were absolutely brutal, they did result in the rise of the Han Dynasty to greatness because they unified China. The irony is that once the Han won, they installed Confucianism back as the ruling ideology. But political structure of China is the same as it was under the legalists. So the legalists actually built a lot of China's political structure, even though for thousands of years later, to call someone a legalist would be like calling them a Nazi. It is similar in that a lot of modern Germany or Spain's political structures do stem from their fascist eras. But China under the Han Dynasty, or as we called it, in Philadelphia, there's a restaurant called Han Dynasty, and I'm from Philly, and so my friends would call it Handy Nasty. Under the Handy Nasty, the Chinese built this massive colonial empire, and the Han Dynasty in population size and in geographic size was comparable to the Roman Empire of the same time period. And the Chinese conquered Vietnam, and they kept Vietnam as a colony for the 1,000 years before the birth of Christ in 1000 AD. And they gave the Vietnamese some completely humiliating name, like Little China south of China. And the biggest issue the Han ran into, and the Han were a pretty reasonable, normal society, they weren't like the Qin, is the northern barbarians. Because the barbarians in the Mongolian steppe, as they are called the Xiongnu, but you should call them the Huns, because they're the same people. There was some controversy over this, but we've discovered they are the same people. The ancestors of the Huns are from Mongolia originally, and they were called the Xiongnu by the Chinese sources, and they had learned how to ride the horse, and they had become really good warriors. And so a theme we'll constantly see through these videos across history is you don't mess with the nomads. The nomads had all their men on horses trained to be warriors, and so they'd ride circles around their enemies, firing arrows, and they had better mobility. And it was really hard to beat the nomads, because if you went out into the grassland, you couldn't chase them down or fight them because they'd always have better mobility than you. And so the Xiongnu nomads were attacking. They were attacking into China, and the Chinese made this giant effort to beat them. And the Chinese exerted more energy to fight the nomads this time than they ever would later in their history. And it was this really epic multi-generation campaign, because first the Huns won. The Chinese gave them a Chinese bride and money to buy them off for a generation, but then they used that generation to fight the nomads again. And so they genocided the nomads. They had Chinese settlements out in the grassland. They hired mercenaries of other nomads, all to fight the nomads. And so the Xiongnu Confederacy was wiped out in this horrifyingly difficult war. And so we're at like a 150 BC now. And in the process, though, of trying to beat the Xiongnu, the Chinese started exploring the area geographically west of them. And so they sent out this guy to discover the lands west of China. And he was captured by the Xiongnu for a generation. And then the Xiongnu, I don't know if it's a generation or a couple of years, the Xiongnu captured him. They gave him a wife. He ran away from his wife, and then he walked west until he hit a group of people called the Hephthalites. And the Hephthalites are an Iranic people in modern Western China. And they had something the Chinese called horses that sweat blood, because the Chinese didn't have good horses to fight the nomads with. And so one of the biggest parts of the Chinese economic military system was buying higher quality horses from Central Asia or modern Turkestan, Xinjiang, and then shipping them to China so the Chinese would have horses to fight the nomads with. And this gradually precipitated a Chinese colonial empire. Tibet, over this time period, Tibet's southwest China, north of that's the Tarim Basin, and then north of that's Mongolia. As a general rule, Tibet and Mongolia are not habitable for Chinese governance, at least until very recently. Well, the Tarim Basin is. And so the Chinese would conquer out into the Tarim Basin. And the Tarim Basin, or modern Uyghur I don't like using the term Xinjiang because Xinjiang is a Chinese translation for basically new territory or new colony, and so the Chinese colonized Turkestan, and Turkestan at that point was inhabited by white people because the indigenous inhabitants of Central Asia were white people, and so you had a big part of the Chinese empire that was populated by people who were basically genetically Europeans, which is something that's weird to think about. And the Hephthalites would have been ethnically Iranian or European or something like that. And the Chinese guy, though, who went out to discover if there were any allies or to talk to the Hephthalites, he kept going west. And he went to Persia and Iraq. And once he reached Iraq, he wanted to see the Roman Empire. But then they told him, the locals told him it's a 1-year voyage to get to the Roman Empire, even though it's not that far a walk to get from Iraq to Roman Syria. And so he never visited Rome because of that, because the locals lied about how long it would take. But this was the first time China discovered the rest of the world existed. And that always shocks me to think that this is a huge civilization, one of the largest and most advanced in the world, and they just had no idea that the rest of the world existed. What does that do to your worldview? So they discovered the Greeks out in the Greeks were still running the Middle East, and so they found the Greeks, which is another weird thing to think about. But China then became part of the Silk Road, and we do have records of Romans visiting China 200 years later under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, where the Romans sailed across India and they reached Beijing, not Beijing, Xi'an, the capital then. The two capitals of ancient China, there were Xi'an and there was Laoyang. Xi'an's further west, Laoyang's further east. I always forget which dynasties had which as capitals. And so China's part of the Silk Road, but the Silk Road is largely not important for ancient Chinese history. It does factor in with disease transfers, though. And so the Han managed China for 400 years, and that was one of China's great golden ages. But halfway through, around the birth of Christ, China had a breakdown under the leadership of Wang Mang. And get your jokes out now. Yeah, but Wang Mang, China had collapsed into these conflicts between different factions because the emperor would have harems with a bunch of women. And so all of these women he was sleeping with, their families were scheming for him to have his heir with their family. And so these different harem families started killing each other. And then this retarded 13-year-old named Wang Mang seized power. And Wang Mang was a Confucian radical who structured China off, we have to maintain the perfect terms for everything. And he made China a socialist economy as well. He tried to break up the landowners and split up control. And socialism is a big theme in Chinese history since the government's so strong. But Wang Mang, society fell apart and it killed 8 million people. And as there were civil wars and revolutions, because Wang Mang was incompetent. And I don't just blame him for events like this. It's often multi-century trajectories that were just a single bad leader shows up at the wrong time, where China at that point was already overpopulated and had lots of factional interests. Wang Mang came about because China was broken. Wang Mang didn't break China. But out of the crisis with Wang Mang came the rise of the eunuchs. And eunuchs are guys who've had their dicks cut off. And they became a huge part of Chinese bureaucracy because you could trust the eunuchs to not push their family because they're not going to have a family. And so the eunuchs became a special interest in China due to that. And I think Western Europe is the only big society to not have eunuchs. And like they're big in a lot of the rest of the world. But eunuchs later on became a corrupt special interest. And as a general rule, every single thing will evolve into being a corrupt special interest after long enough. And after that, we moved from a different faction of the Han dynasty took over. And China then had another empire for 200 years. And then, I forgot to say this, but defeating the Xiongnu resulted in a catapulting of the Xiongnu were defeated by the Chinese. They went west. They knocked at the Hephthalites in modern Western China. They knocked at the Kushans in Central Asia. They attacked India, and also defeating the Hephthalites pushed the Huns west until they attacked the Roman Empire. And so the Chinese defeating the Han Confederacy actually resulted in outsized political effects for the next 600 years. It basically created the history of Central Asia. And it wiped out the Greek kingdom in Afghanistan too. I don't know if the Parthians were involved. It wouldn't surprise me if they were. The Parthians were the rulers of Persia. The Second Han Dynasty, and that falls apart in 200 AD. And these crises are often congruent across Eurasia, as I said before. So Wang Mang is roughly equivalent to Caligula and the fall of the Roman Republic. The Warring States period is roughly equivalent to the Diadochi period of the Greeks, between all the successors of Alexander fighting each other. They had the Axial Age at the same time. The crisis of the 3rd century, which we talk about in the Fall of Rome video, which nearly killed Rome, that happened at the same time as the fall of the Han Dynasty. And the period that comes after the final fall of the Second Han Dynasty, around 200 AD, is the period of Chinese romance and Chinese adventure, where in the same way Westerners treat the Middle Ages as our adventurous period, where King Arthur, it's where fantasy novels are based out of time-wise, Siegfried, and for America it's the Wild West. And China's great romantic period and a period of adventure and heroism is after the fall of the Han Dynasty with the Three Kingdoms. And there's this Chinese movie called Red Cliff, which is about that time period. And Red Cliff is like 7 hours. It's ridiculous. I also don't really like it as a movie. It's very flashy. It has a lot of adventure, but I don't think it's like that well done as a story or that compelling. It's Chinese Lord of the Rings. But there is this big epic written in the 16th century about the Warring States period, and that's China's great novel. It's China's The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby isn't even big enough to compare to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And there's a Chinese heavy metal song called Sichuan the Emperor, which is set about that time period. So a lot of Chinese culture comes out of it. And what occurred was that the warlord Cao Cao took over North China, and then South China was ruled by a couple different kingdoms. And so these South Chinese kingdoms were, because the ethnic Chinese hadn't colonized the South. The southern half of China were ethnically different at that point. But there were these North Chinese generals who had colonized the South, and they were fighting the North. And assume all Chinese wars are massive, assume millions of people die. But this War of the Three Kingdoms was massive, and it continued for a long period of time. And China had the Jin dynasty briefly, which accomplished nothing. But over this time period, so the Jin unified China after the Three Kingdoms period, and then China fell apart. And so China hit its dark age at the same period as European classical civilization had its dark age. And so we've gone through the whole period of Chinese history between the foundation of the Shang dynasty, the formation of the Zhou dynasty, which resulted in disunity, then the Warring States period, the Qin winning power back, and then the Han dynasty rising and falling. So we've covered a lot of history in this episode, and I've had to go through this really quickly, and there's a lot of details I wouldn't be able to touch. But that's a history of ancient China. Hi, everybody. I forgot to add the book recommendations that I normally do, so I'll throw this in later. One of the things I found with reading history, and especially civilizational history, is not all authors are created equal, in that a handful of authors will write very good books that explain multiple topics better than any other specialist. Rise of the West by McNeill. This has the best summation of Chinese civilization itself. John Key's book on China is a great source as well. The Cambridge History of China by Ebry, I think that was pretty good. I read that for college. The Soul of China by Amaury de Riencourt. I'll always rep Amaury de Riencourt. He does a lot better on the civilizational and cultural level. Will Durant's book on our Oriental heritage, the China chapter on this, which is 200 pages, is very good. I would also recommend Michael Wood's History of China and A History of Chinese Civilization by Jacques Garnet. Peace.
History 102 by Rudyard Lynch and Eric Tornberg is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, Live Players, and Econ 102. If you like the episode, subscribe, follow on YouTube, forward to a friend, and let us know what else you want us to cover. Thank you for listening.